The question of good and evil, positive and negative, plus and minus, would and should. These misunderstood primeval dichotomies occupied me for a time before my early 50s prime, when my weird, revered, and bearded wraith appeared, and I found my eighth new face after my second or third, upon my word, spiritual rebirth. Beyond Baroque is a literary cultural center. It has poetry readings and a bookstore, small press literary publications, musical events, and an art gallery. Essentially, its importance resides in the fact that it's a center for writers. And it's one of the few in the country. Beyond Baroque is a place where poets and other writers come to hear each other, to share, and also attend workshops. Most of the people who are there today were not there during the decade that I was the head of Beyond Baroque. They can only imagine the excitement that there was because of all the people who gathered around. I started Beyond Baroque. I think that is my main claim to fame.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. George Drury Smith.
I recently presented an award that was named after me. When I go around Beyond Baroque, I feel like a ghost out of the past. But people honor me constantly because of what they think I might have done, which I don't think I did very much, but I did start it. I have a book coming out that I worked on for many years. It's a work of fiction. That's my first published book. It took a few years to write.
How many?
From the time I started, 30. It took me a long time to find my voice, as it were. Oh.
What's this?
This was, I guess, my first Christmas tree.
What year is this?
I was a very lonely child growing up. By the time I was 2.5, the stock market crash had caused us to lose our home and move in with my mother's parents. There were no other houses around and no other children to play with, and so I had total lack of experience playing with other children. But eventually, of course, I wanted to write. But I was unwilling to conform to how people wanted me to write. I wanted to write differently. When I wrote things for my English classes, a couple of teachers compared my writing to Gertrude Stein. I was also inspired by classical poetry like Wordsworth, where there was a lot of alliteration and rhyme. I remember I wrote, "The briny broth brought back to me memories of the open sea." This was sort of an imitation of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. My English teachers turned me on to New Directions, which was an anthology of experimental writing. This was to influence my aesthetics. By the time I was a teenager, I was really strange. And of course, I was gay. There were various men or boys that I was attracted to. And I knew I wasn't attracted to girls, but the corollary of that never occurred to me. I didn't, because in the 1940s, who knew? Queer was probably the most common word in those days, fairy, and I was called both. In high school, I didn't even know what it meant. By the time I was ready to graduate from high school, I was ready to rebel. I was ready to get out of my environment, which I found very confining. So the night I graduated from high school, I went to Mexico. That was the beginning of many escapes. I started drinking. But that didn't solve my problems. I went into the service after that. When I was in the Army, there were several men that I was attracted to, though I didn't realize it was sexual. So it wasn't really until after I was out of the service and was in college that I had what might be called my first affair. My early sexual experiences were all connected with drinking. I might have committed suicide in my early 20s if I hadn't discovered this release, this rebellion that alcohol provided. I was in my early 30s when alcoholism had really set in, and I was having serious withdrawal problems and I had virtually no friends. And I just attempted suicide one day and nearly succeeded. And that was not the last of my suicide attempts either. No. Alcohol made it possible for me to live until it made it impossible. In the early 60s, I moved to Venice, California, where there had been some small elements of the beat movement. However, that scene was pretty much gone. Los Angeles had never been recognized as a literary center, so I decided to start a literary magazine. I had been reading a lot of Spanish Baroque period literature, which I liked very much, but I wanted to do some of those same ways of writing poetry, but modernizing them for the 20th century. So I will be Beyond Baroque. So I had a cover printed for it, but I didn't have the money to publish it. I actually started Beyond Baroque when I was still drinking, though I was trying to stop. I had been through the last legal experiment done with LSD to help alcoholics, but what really happened had opened my eyes just a bit to bisexuality. As my drinking progressed, I wasn't getting into any permanent relationships with anyone. But then a woman who was married to a high school friend of mine visited me. She wanted to rescue me from alcoholism and homosexuality. I was desperate. So we got married. It sort of worked. It wasn't the same as being with a man. I never felt it the same way. And I went back to school and got a teaching credential, teaching high school in Santa Monica. But then my mother died and left me $40,000. My wife suggested, perhaps unwisely, she later thought, that I spend the money for the magazine. So I decided to do that, and actually bought a building on what was then West Washington Boulevard, now Abbot Kinney Boulevard in Venice. As I look at some of the old photos, I really kind of recapture the excitement that there was in those days, these crowds of people. It was an exciting place. As far as the history, I'm the only one that knows what really happened, and a few others. Axine lived here on the second floor, and I lived on the third floor. So it was very much an artist colony at that time. Everyone in the building was connected to Beyond Baroque, in fact. It's a 3-story building with a storeroom on the first floor and 4 apartments above, and there was a house in back. We called it the Pagoda. It was once a railroad station in the middle of Venice Boulevard, and the station had been moved to the back of this property. The front building was a total wreck. The plumbing was all broke, the windows were gone, etc. So we fixed it up with pipe tape and baling wire. So we managed to put it together, and Beyond Baroque moved in there. The front of the building was a storefront. I decided, let's have an art gallery. So in November 1968, it opened as an introduction of the magazine, and we also had some paintings hanging in the gallery. We did get some subscriptions in, but it was not an immediate success, to say the least. It didn't take off. Probably it wasn't good enough and so forth. During the very early months of Beyond Baroque, a friend of mine with whom I'd had a brief relationship came to town, and we had a long talk about his life and mine, and I saw how happy he was being a gay man and accepting it and being a creative person, and I decided that's what I had to do. And I left Anne in order to be myself, in order to be a gay man and live a creative life that way. And I started to come out to people. I could never have continued Beyond Baroque had I continued to drink, because several associates were very patient, but that patience wouldn't have lasted. It didn't with a number of them. But in 1971, when I sobered up, then that enabled me to go unfettered, as it were. Once I sobered up, I was able to engage in longer-term relationships. I had a relationship with a young man. I lived above Beyond Baroque, and he lived in the apartment next to mine for quite a few years. We're still very close friends.
Hello.
Oh, hi, Anne. How are you? It's
Hi.
George.
A lot of these places require 4 months lead time.
Yeah.
So
The publisher and I are getting really excited about the release of my book.
I am ecstatic. Really. And we are pushing it on all our social media. So, I mean, it fits right in with the kind of books.
They're getting ready to do publicity and trying to get reviews. All the pieces are coming together.
Bye-bye.
One pillar of my belief is some sort of faith. And at its simplest, it's faith in the idea that everything will turn out all right. Now, obviously, it doesn't. At least it doesn't seem to. But we know only a little. More will be revealed. When I started Beyond Baroque, it was really a team. We had a lot of volunteers, in particular Jim Crusoe.
I was just out of college, and I walked by and I saw this dark store that said on the top, Beyond Baroque. And in the front, there were a bunch of vacuum cleaners in the window. And I heard this noise in back that was kind of like a chipmunk. And it turned out to be George working on a machine called the Verityper. And I said, hi, what are you doing? And George said, I'm putting together a literary magazine. And the light went on in my head, and I said, oh, well, I'd like to work on a literary magazine. Can I help? And George said, oh, sure, here, take some manuscripts and come back and tell me what you think of them, and we'll see what can happen. Little by little, we helped put together the magazine. Rather quickly ran out of the money to do the glossy version. And the 70s is one of those great moments in history where it looked as if anything could work out. And we weren't into judging. We were into seeing what we could do next and like looking forward to anything that came through the door.
Anything new?
USA Poetry.
Here's a poem called Love Calls Us to the Things of This World.
In the 20th century, it became almost taboo to use poetic devices such as rhythm and rhyme. Those are the things I wanted to see come back into poetry, not in the old sing-song A, B, B, C, C, D pattern of rhyme, but in a new and much more free way. And I think rap does that, and so do I. Anyway, when I started Beyond Baroque, I was hoping that my ideas about poetry would be adopted and that I'd start a whole new literary movement. Well, that didn't happen. What happened is probably much better. People did not subscribe at all to my ideas. They wanted it to go in new directions. So I let it become what it would become. Although I still published my avant-garde magazine, we started another magazine that was called New Letters, and then it was called New, and increased our circulation. In 1969, John Harris and Joe Hansen started the Venice Poetry Workshop. Every Friday evening we had a poetry reading, sometimes 2 or 3 or even more poets. And that's how it started. So from a magazine, it turned into a cultural center. We had 2 rooms that were devoted to the library. We had close to 20,000 volumes of things that had been published by the small presses. It was the largest independent such library at the time, and people would come in to read. People dropped in. This was Venice. You know, it was hippie Venice. There was a constant flow of people coming in to hang around, and maybe they had a poem in their back pocket or whatever. Also, writers came. There was a lot of excitement around Beyond Baroque. Our poetry readings took place with overflow audience. And eventually we even put loudspeakers up on the sidewalk so people outside could listen. Usually there was at least one poet scheduled, and sometimes a well-known poet.
I wrote this poem one night because it occurred to me that all the other poems I had written that were published, that were in some poetry magazine, were unworthy of what poetry does, or what it does for me. I don't want to own men's souls. I want just to be a poet. To write words of startling beauty, to fill the universe of emptiness in your soul. To make the trees dance and the winds curl back upon themselves like confetti off a ship. I want your tears. I want to reach the depth of such beauty. I want the universe to suffer. Because beauty is a pain beyond pain that dies in the willow as well as in the wars of men. I want all men to own my soul, the poet's soul, for it's always for the asking. I want to belong to all the nations and all the oceans. I want to belong to all the earth, the planets, all the stars, and all the spaces beyond all spaces. I want to be God.
So you don't like free verse poetry. I'd like to hear about that.
It has been said that I don't like poetry.
No, you said you don't like poetry. Don't give me that.
I really didn't like most of the prose poetry, and I accepted Jim's judgment because that's mostly what we published. The organization was moderately successful, and I saw no reason to try to impose my ideas. New Magazine was a West Coast magazine, strictly, promoting West Coast writers because they've been grossly neglected by the Eastern establishment. We have become a nonprofit organization, getting grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. There was a federal program called CETA. We used this to hire people, training them in clerical skills or whatever. They had work. We had a lot of crazy people, including some that were certifiable. One of the poets that appeared on the scene was Axine Cervenka. She was in the CETA program. It was in the poetry workshop that she met John Doe. I believe they founded the punk rock group X. We started having summer festivals in the 70s, music and poetry and dance. We did a lot of promotion, and Beyond Baroque Center was sort of built on the basis of this promotion. It was an exciting place. There was a lot happening. We got involved in the California Poetry in the Schools program. We did one issue on poetry by students in these classes. Everything was going very well about the release of my book. Then suddenly the publisher was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. She died in December, and the book, I guess, ended up being the last book that she published. No one did most of the promotion that they usually did for a book. And the publishing house closed down after that. Just the fact of getting it out there was very important to me. Towards the end of the 70s, I was frankly getting tired of the salaries you get in the nonprofit area. I was making more than anyone else, but that was still $800 a month or something. I was working for the Argonaut newspaper to support myself, and I saw as my salvation to get Beyond Baroque out of this building I had bought, because for one thing, it was not adequate any longer. Space is very important for any cultural organization. If you have a space and attract creative people, you will create a center of creation. Venice City Hall had been occupied by city offices, but the city moved out, and I approached Councilwoman Pat Russell to see if we could get it. She worked with us very closely, and we managed to get a 10-year lease on it for $1 a year. This was a huge step forward, so we moved around the corner onto Venice Boulevard into the old Venice City Hall. Beyond Baroque is still there, and it's still flourishing. After that, I retired from Beyond Baroque, and I actually was in a relationship. By 1980, I was in a relationship that lasted 8 years. This, of course, was the era of AIDS, and he died of AIDS in 1988. And I went into depression and drank again. The results were not good. I'd lost the faith in the idea that things turn out all right. I had questions of good and evil. There is evil in the world. There is bad. It didn't, at that moment, seem to me that everything is going to turn out all right. It certainly didn't for him. But then who knows where he is now, you know. I don't have his phone number anymore, but maybe he's there someplace. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to believe that things always turn out all right and that the world is nothing but good, but then why not think that at least? It doesn't make any sense, but it works for me.
If you want to take your seats, we're going to get started. Join me in welcoming George.
It was a very long process writing the book and getting it published, and I was very pleased with the result. The fact that it wasn't a huge success, it doesn't bother me really. My life is pretty serene now. Mostly things don't upset me, except when I'm driving. And it's really become a very good life. I have a husband of more than 20 years who lives in Amsterdam, and I spend about half my time there with him. I spend part of my time in Los Angeles. I share the apartment with a dear friend who's become like a son to me. So I have a husband and sort of a son. I love being in Europe because it gives me a chance to go to Paris once or twice a year. I'm very grateful for what I have now. At one time, I came to believe that everything was going to turn out for the best. But my faith was somewhat shattered. And so I had to rethink all that. But I really came to the conclusion again that things turn out the way they're supposed to turn out. If we have goals, if we work towards our goals and accept what we get, it will be usually better than what we expected. So what I've learned is to go with the flow and to accept what I get, because there's no way ever to know how things would have turned out if it had been different. The question of good and evil, positive and negative, plus and minus, would and should. These misunderstood primeval dichotomies occupied me for a time before my early 50s prime, when my weird, revered, and bearded wraith appeared, and I found my eighth new face, after my second or third, upon my word, spiritual rebirth. Oh yes, I reappeared, and what I thought I heard in that cliched rehash was that everything will be all right as long as we grow and don't fight the flow, and know that as above, below. Yes, that if we strive to love the worst and try to thrive, that the isotropic and isotopically esoteric vertices, tenons and mortices of scoped hopes that scoop and loop through hoops of striving rhyming verses are positive, and that we live in a fine and mostly benign universe, where age-old canon treatises are more prevalent and prevailing than the cyber-fiber vortex traces of malevolent curses and the worst rebel level of the universe. But we wallowed and then finally waddled mellow out of the harsh and shallow marsh to the end gate, where we waited before that festive, perhaps fictive, portico fresco and a helix pro-hole pop chopper porthole climb. Yes, we waited for the span end of time. And this was coupled at last with the serenely simple and untroubled double doctrine that although much is concealed, more will be revealed.
George Drury Smith, the founder of Beyond Baroque Literary Arts Center. Give this man a standing ovation such as he has never heard in his life. Bravo! Bravo indeed.
Hello, I'm Peter Fitzgerald. Thanks for watching Beyond Mr. Smith. The movie was wonderfully received. The film was completed in 2019, but we had our premiere in November of 2018. And since then, it's gone on to receive an award at the Amsterdam International Film Festival as Best Documentary Short World Cinema, and it was the jury prize. So it was a wonderful labor of love for everybody involved. George is doing great, by the way. He's hale and hearty, and we wish him many, many more years. Well, the film cost quite a lot of money to make, and it was, as I said, a labor of love, and it all came out of pocket. So I'm hoping that you might make a donation to my Patreon, which is linked below. And if you'd like to make a direct donation, you can do so at Venmo at Butch Please. That's Venmo at Butch Please. My newest film is called Butch Please, by the way. It is an exploration of gay masculinity at the International Mr. Leather Contest in 2019. I hope you can take a moment to look at the trailer for the film. It has also been well received as well. It went to the Amdocs Festival this year in 2021, and it's in consideration for several others. So we hope you stick around. Anyway, again, please make a donation, and thanks for watching.